Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm your host, Jack Malde, Associate Director at the Bipartisan Policy Center. In this week's episode, BPC Senior Advisor Theresa Brown discusses how DHS and USCIS are incorporating AI into their immigration work. Theresa is joined by Paromita Shah, co-founder and executive director of Just Futures Law, who organized a letter signed by over 140 immigrant and civil rights groups to DHS Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas, urging him to end the use of AI. Then, Theresa and I discussed the inauguration of Mexico's first female president, Claudia Sheinbaum, and the challenge of distinguishing who is legally in the United States in the current era. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm Theresa Cardinal Brown. On December 3rd, 2020, President Trump signed Executive Order 13960, promoting the use of trustworthy artificial intelligence in the federal government. Federal agencies are required to create and make publicly available an inventory of non-classified and non-sensitive artificial intelligence, or AI, use cases, to the extent practicable and in accordance with applicable law and policy. That's a quote. On October 30th, 2023, President Biden followed up on this with Executive Order 14110 on the safe, secure, and trustworthy development and use of artificial intelligence, the AIEO, as we call it. So earlier this year, the Department of Homeland Security became the first federal agency to announce a plan to incorporate generative AI models across a wide range of its divisions, including Customs and Border Protection, CBP, and U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, USCIS. In partnerships with major private tech companies such as OpenAI, Anthropic, and Meta, it promised to launch pilot programs using chatbots and other tools to help combat drug and human trafficking crimes, train immigration officials, and prepare emergency management across the nation. However, legal and immigrant advocacy communities across the country raise concerns. Some claim that the incorporation of artificial intelligence in CBP and USCIS work will result in facilitating legal immigration while ensuring integrity and security, as well as enhancing approval prediction, process optimization, fraud detection, and identity management. But in a recent letter to Secretary Mayorkas, more than 140 privacy, civil rights, and immigrant advocacy organizations said that DHS's use of AI appears to violate federal policies governing the responsible use of AI, particularly when it comes to AI used to make life-impacting decisions on immigration enforcement and adjudications. The group that led that letter is Just Futures Law, an organization that provides legal support to grassroots groups and organizers advocating against deportation and criminalization. So it's my pleasure to welcome Paromita Shah, who is founding executive director of Just Futures Law. Paromita is a racial and immigrant justice lawyer who works alongside community-based movements to end mass deportation, criminalization, and surveillance. Before co-founding JFL in 2019, Paromita served as Associate Director of the National Immigration Project of the National Lawyers Guild, as the Detention Project Director at the Capital Area Immigrant Rights Coalition in Washington, D.C., and as a staff attorney at the Greater Boston Legal Services. So welcome to the podcast, Paromita.
Thank you for having me today.
So could you tell us a little bit more about this letter, its content, and what provoked the strong negative reaction to the ways DHS has been incorporating AI technology in the work of the immigration agencies?
Yeah, our organization has been investigating, researching, and looking at how technology is being used at the Department of Homeland Security. And we have uncovered this vast array of technologies that have been operating with little or no oversight. And once the hype of artificial intelligence fully engulfed the nation, the Department of Homeland Security was not immune to that hype. And what we began to see was, there were just numerous references to AI technology or large language models, LLMs, or AI enhanced technologies being referenced in so many programs and technologies being used by DHS that we felt like it was really important. It's just a really important time to look at how AI was being used. And so we conducted an investigation. Normally we look at ICE. Normally we look at Customs and Border Protection. But this time we really wanted to look at USCIS and the reason why we wanted to is because, first of all, USCIS touches millions of people a year, right? 8 million applications per year, including nearly 900,000 naturalization applications per year. There's close to 3 million deportation cases, right, at the Executive Office of Immigration Review. And most of those cases rely on a USCIS determination. And so, given the fact that AI was going to have such a broad reach within USCIS, we wanted to know what was happening, right? How was it going to be used? And, what we discovered was kind of chilling for us, as advocates, was that, all the people that we know who are impacted by USCIS, right? That could be your family members, your workers, your employers, your DACA recipients, your tourists, people fleeing persecution. All of those people had a pretty high chance of running into AI at DHS. And I think, what we began to see was that after these policies were released by the Biden administration, was that DHS was kind of giving lip service to a lot of the requirements under these new policies, which required like ongoing monitoring of bias and discrimination. It required notice of adverse decisions. It required things like an AI inventory that was supposed to be updated. It required a different level of transparency because they all acknowledged that AI was a very powerful tool. And once we discovered that these benchmarks weren't being met, we felt it was really important for DHS to meet these benchmarks. At a very important date, which is December 1st, 2024. And we felt like it was important at that point to call for DHS to either suspend the use of these technologies or terminate them altogether, because we just don't know what DHS, and I don't think, to be honest, DHS knows what's under the hood.
Yeah. It's interesting. So your letter pointed to several specific AI use cases at DHS, and including one called a predicted to naturalize AI tool, certain algorithms used by ICE and CBP's use of biometric surveillance. So would you like to delve deeper into any or all of these specific cases and what the issues you saw from your organization's perspective were with some of these?
Yeah, so what we saw that DHS was planning to do was, eventually create a roadmap, a plan to start either making decisions or helping officers make decisions on eligibilities for immigration benefits or relief, even though these are extremely fact-based, complex determinations, where immigration law has been acknowledged across the board as being one of the most complex laws, in the entire world. And yet AI was really going to unpack this miraculously and look into really complex facts, and AI could figure that all out. I think another thing that I was planning to do was to look at determinations of credibility and fraud. And even though we hear a lot about credibility and fraud these days, that is still a very complex, fact-based determination. And, it's been used as a dog whistle for a long time. And I think it was really concerning to us that we heard that DHS was going to start scanning, potentially using the data that it had collected from individuals to make those determinations, especially when it came to life-changing, life-altering decisions like asylum or removal. And then lastly, like that they were also going to make decisions about public safety or national security threats. And we know that DHS has had a hard time kind of making those determinations in the past, and has made a lot of mistakes, and, has kind of expanded this exception for national security and public safety in a way that it can almost engulf the entire immigration adjudication process. And so, the programs that we looked at, one was called Asylum Text Analytics. And what that really did is that it claimed to look at plagiarism-based fraud, and in asylum and withholding applications. And the way it would do that, it was to scan what's called the narrative part of the application and look to see if there were duplicates repeated across applications. And to make those assessments, it would also have to look at what other applications had used similar language before, right? And I think that the way that they were looking at it was to say, what if these stories don't align? And for anyone who's worked on an asylum application, it is not uncommon to use standardized language in a way so that
you have similar
can
cases, that
Yeah.
similar fact patterns you're going to, or country conditions in the country, you're going to use language that is similar.
And to have that potentially flagged as plagiarism or fraud felt like it was a big flag for us, right? It was a flag for people who'd be impacted by that. And I think it would be particularly susceptible to discrimination for people who speak different languages, come from different cultures, where there's already existing bias within the Department of Homeland Security against people from different countries, particularly, people who are Black, people who are Muslim. And so the other program that we looked at also was called the Fraud Detection and National Security, FDNS. It's called FDNS DS Next Gen. And that was, also going to look at fraud, public safety, national security concerns. And the way it was going to do that was to introduce a predictive modeling system within AI so they could predict, right? They could use a model that could predict whether somebody was a national security threat. And, as we know now, there is a wide band of scholarship, abundant scholarship now that is looking at predictive modeling. And there's numerous concerns about how it could exacerbate bias, exacerbate errors. It's frankly just inaccurate and compounds errors, right, within the AI models that are being used. The last one that we looked at was called Predicted to Naturalize. And ironically, that was named in the AI inventory that DHS has. But after we wrote the report, it was taken off the inventory as not being used anymore, which kind of goes to show you that the inventory that they have up there now does not represent with kind of any clarity, what they're using now, how is it being used, and the descriptions, if you look in that inventory, are sparse, very limited information. And I can tell you that it's been pretty clear to us that there's been no consultation with communities who would be most directly impacted by these technologies. Another one, I'm happy to go through a list.
Well, let's go back for a second, because you said DHS hasn't consulted with these communities. So let me ask, have you or other organizations tried to have conversations with DHS about these concerns before you sent the letter? And if so, what was DHS's response?
Yeah, DHS hasn't formally responded to our letter. I think once this letter follows a report that we had written called Automating Deportation. And Automating Deportation is, a 50-page report where we look at all these kind of like not only the USCIS AI products, but also some CBP and ICE products. And the reason why we looked at them and kind of created this robust report that initially we thought was going to be 5 pages was because we thought we needed to do our homework and figure out, what DHS was planning to use. So we read all the PIAs, the privacy impact assessments, to see how it was going to impact privacy, how it was going to impact constitutional rights. And we did find information about how DHS was planning to use AI, but not really how it's planning to consult or share how it's going to be used with communities in particular. And that's why we put together the letter. We're like, why are you basically creating an inventory of products, plowing forward with your agenda to kind of incorporate more AI products without talking to us about the impacts of it? And when we asked around, it began to be clear to us that people don't even know when these AI products have been used on them. And that felt to us to be really concerning. How do you have accountability in AI, right? How do you have accountability over a system if you never know it's been used in your case, right? How do you explore that? And we didn't even have an opportunity, I think, to raise that with DHS. It's probably been one of our biggest concerns.
Yeah. So we mentioned at the top that there's a deadline coming up, December 1st, 2024, relating to these use case inventories, which are required under the executive orders. Tell us a little bit more about what these deadlines are and what you and your organizations believe should happen, and maybe what you expect DHS to do.
Yeah, so AI has been regulated in a number of ways, though the regulation is sparse and very incomplete. But Congress has passed some laws. As you mentioned before, the president has passed some executive orders, and the Office of Management and Budget has also passed some regulations, and they are instructing agencies to meet certain guidelines so that rights, discrimination, bias is mitigated within federal agencies who begin to use AI. And those dates look like this, right? This EO that was issued last year was followed by a memo in March of 2024 that instructed all these agencies to basically list which of these programs are using AI. And it gave them a deadline of December so that they can figure out whether they need extensions, whether there's going to be waivers for these programs so that they don't have to be shared with the public, or whether they're even meeting some of these kind of like basic benchmarks around accountability, compliance with constitutional norms, et cetera. And that deadline is in December. However, DHS very recently, just last week, came out with its own plan about how it's going to comply with the OMB regulations. And when it did that, it said, listen, we want to know ICE, CBP, USCIS, whether these programs impact people's rights by December, but you have to let us know if you want an extension of your assessment by October 15th. And then what would happen is that the chief artificial intelligence officer, who's called the KO, will make decisions, is the only one who's able to make decisions on all these waivers and exemptions that these agencies may ask for. And so it felt like a really kind of like dangerous self-certification process. An agency says, I need an exception or a waiver. And the KO from DHS says, of course. And who's going to conduct oversight, over those decisions? I don't know, right? None of us know. And so those decisions are coming up this year. And I think the danger of that is twofold. One is, are these programs going to be delivered potentially to an organization that has a very different idea of what immigration enforcement looks like in 2025? And two is, even so, it gives such a wide berth to these agencies to avoid and escape accountability over these systems if they can continue to ask for extensions, waivers, exemptions from these protocols. And so we're really kind of looking at December as a key date for us as to how DHS should respond to communities about whether these technologies are rights impacting or not.
Paromita, you've used the term accountability several times.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly I think you see the letter that you sent from your organizations as trying to get the government to be accountable to external groups and the public. You've talked about the lack of internal accountability, maybe inside DHS. What about Congress? Congress also has an oversight role. Has Congress looked at this at all with regard to DHS, or do you see Congress weighing in terms of oversight and hearings? Or have they expressed any interest in this that you're aware of?
I think we would really welcome it. I think DHS has gone under the radar for a long time, kind of about the deployment of AI, even though it's so central to its use within all federal agencies. It really does view itself as a lead agency and how AI will be used and the safeguards around AI, in other agencies. And it is, as the largest law enforcement agency in the United States, right? And so I think what Congress could do is to have hearings about how is it being used? How are they planning to comply with these new rules? Are people being notified when it's going to be used? Who has been consulted and for what reason? Why haven't immigrant rights groups or groups experienced in immigration law and immigration enforcement been consulted over the impact of these technologies in these adjudications. I think there's a lot of room for that, but it hasn't happened yet. Ironically, there has been a lot of concern about artificial intelligence generally. And the reason why is because I think it's been, in my view, taken over by corporations who are looking to escape regulation on their products. Because it's not only that DHS is making these AI products, it is using products designed by corporations.
You mentioned some of those at the top. Yeah.
Right. And I think that's really, that kind of regulation has been of some concern. But right now, Congress and honestly, our government feels like it's an AI war. And the AI war is something that they're very invested in winning. And so, DHS sadly has fallen under the radar.
Yeah. One other way that the government sometimes is held accountable is through litigation. And certainly in the immigration space, we have seen a lot of litigation over the last several years. Do you foresee future litigation, either in individual cases or collectively, about how the government has been using AI in these cases, in these situations?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're beginning to see litigation in other sectors where AI products have been shown to exacerbate bias, make profound errors, whether it's in hiring, in housing applications, in bankings, and loans, in credit information. These are all things that everybody in the United States, no matter your status, experience, right? And those kinds of discrepancies are profound and can really make a difference in somebody's life in a very profound and negative way. And there are some lawsuits. We're just beginning to explore lawsuits in this area. And so, for example, we did, sue Clearview AI, which is a facial recognition company, which, AI is in their name. And facial recognition is definitely something that DHS is planning to use and has already created policy on how it plans to use, even though it's still very unclear how DHS will use facial recognition at the border, at airports all the time, in the interior, and how that information will be shared, right? Not only amongst DHS agencies, but with local law enforcement and potentially with other agencies, right, that people interact with every day. And so those kinds of lawsuits are really critical as an important tactic to bring accountability to DHS and the corporations who are building products for DHS. And we need more of that. So I definitely see that ramping up. We definitely will be bringing our own litigation in the future. But I think it's really important for DHS, instead of trying to escape accountability in terms of not providing notice to people when these products are being used, it is really important for us to know how and when it's being used so we can track it and we can understand ourselves, right, how AI is working on the communities we live in.
You've talked a lot about the concerns over the use of AI in immigration. Are there any potential positive uses of AI that you can foresee? I mean, we do have an immigration system that is suffering immense backlogs. And are there ways, I mean, this is one of the positive things that DHS is claiming, that there are ways that it can help, get through some of this backlog and help adjudicators be more productive and efficient. Do you see some potential positives if the accountability is there? Like, is it that you're just concerned that we just don't know enough, or do you think that there are potential positives that could happen here?
We're not just anti-AI. I don't think this is like kind of like a knee-jerk reaction of being anti-AI. Data is something that is needed for AI to work. And the way that data is extracted from the public today is something that everyone actually should be deeply concerned, because it is sold and shared, often without our knowledge or consent or without a warrant. And so those are the concerns that I have, is actually about regulation of our data and the use of artificial intelligence on data. AI is simply an algorithm, right? It is a black box right now. Data comes in, it is analyzed in a black box, and there's an output that comes out. I think what we would like to know more about is how is it being how's it being used? Do I think there are positive applications for AI? Absolutely. And I think there are many sectors, including immigration, that could benefit from that. But in the meantime, the kinds of applications that we're hearing about are, AI being used to evaluate asylum claims, right? Not about AI being used to, maybe kind of deal with kind of vanilla, family adjustment claims, right? So people can kind of get through their immigration cases clearly where there's, no underlying issues. That is, of course, those are good applications. But when you start off with fraud and national security, and not without only as, looking at this from a public safety, national security problem, which of course are, I can see why DHS is going to be engaged in that. But it seems like it is really consuming a lot of the bandwidth of the AI products that are being contemplated at DHS. And that, I think, is a real loss, for all of us.
So before we end, are there any final thoughts you have to share with our audience about how you and your fellow organizations are looking at this, where you see this going, and what you think is going to happen next?
I think it's important to remember that DHS has a huge amount of data, and that this data isn't just about the people who are applying to come to the United States. It also includes families, their neighbors, their communities. And I do remember reading in a DHS, compliance memo when they were talking about how they were going to comply with the new regulations, that DHS as an entity actually interacts with more people in the United States than almost any other agency. And I think then that should really impart the importance of regulation, compliance, and accountability, since DHS has such a strong history of, anti-Black bias within its adjudications, political and geographic bias, right? Why do some places have a 95% denial rate? Why do some places have a 70% denial rate? Why is there such language, access, and justice that happen? I think we can't ignore, the underlying problems in the data that DHS has. And if we're really concerned about how AI is going to operate, I think it's important more than ever for, like you said, members of Congress, for DHS to be more concerned, right? And act more quickly in a really concrete way to ensure that the rights of our communities, are upheld.
I mean, as you noted, we're sort of at the dawning of the AI age, and there's just so much sort of interest in it and new ways of approaching it. So, we're going to have to follow this for a long while to come, I think. So thank you so much, Paromita. We will take a short break, and when we come back, we'll discuss the inauguration of Mexico's first female president and the challenge of distinguishing who is legally in the United States in the current era. So stay tuned.
On October 1st, Claudia Sheinbaum was inaugurated as President of Mexico, succeeding Andres Manuel López Obrador, with both of them from López Obrador's Morena party. Sheinbaum is Mexico's first female president and takes office at a time when Mexico is dealing with the challenges of increasing migration and the sometimes testy relationship with the United States on that issue. So this week we have Theresa, who is in Mexico City for the North Capital Forum. And so we wanted to talk to her about this new era in US-Mexico relations and how it might or might not change. So, hi, Theresa.
Hi, Jack.
So you're down there in Mexico City right now during the inauguration of the new president. What is the atmosphere like down there?
Well, as you can imagine, it's celebratory. Sheinbaum won very handily in the national elections over other candidates from lesser parties. In addition, she brought with her majorities in the Mexican Senate and Chamber of Deputies. So she's got a clean sweep for the Morena party. And interestingly, because of the time between the elections, which happened in June, and the time she took office here, her predecessor, Andres Manuel López Obrador, known as AMLO, did push through some changes that have been a little controversial, particularly around the judiciary, through the new Congress, which took the new Congress was seated before the new president. So one of these changes is about making all federal judges in the country elected rather than appointed. And this change has created some concerns among, including the United States, about what this may mean for the rule of law in Mexico. But stepping back over to the immigration front, immigration wasn't a huge issue in the presidential campaign in Mexico. It's not politically as big an issue here as it is in the United States. For the most part, to the extent that Sheinbaum talked about migration or immigration in the campaign, it was about Mexican immigrants in the United States and kind of the persistent request that from Mexico that the United States find a way to legalize them. Otherwise, it just wasn't that big an issue. Going forward, what she has said is she wants to focus on increasing labor mobility between Mexico and the United States. And that, of course, means more work visas or more ability for Mexicans and others in the United States to get work. With regards to the migration that's coming through Mexico to the United States, we know that Mexico has been doing a lot in the last several months on enforcing immigration against migrants getting to the border. So there's this program where migrants that come up to the U.S.-Mexico border are being bussed back to the south. Mexico is not doing a lot of deportations, but they're basically this kind of, whether you call it a merry-go-round or it's been called chutes and ladders or whatever, but basically this way of taking migrants that are making their way north and then sending back south so that they have to try over again and hopefully deterring them from doing so. At the same time, they are encountering more immigrants coming into Mexico while the United States is seeing fewer at the border. So Mexico is doing a lot on immigration enforcement right now, and it's a question of how long that is going to be sustainable. And then, the relationship between Mexico and the United States on immigration. Why is Mexico doing all this enforcement now when they didn't necessarily do it before? Well, I think some of it is because they recognize how important the issue is in the U.S. election. And so by kind of reducing the pressure on the border, they are hoping to make it less of an issue in the U.S. election. I would say their success there has been rather limited.
So, we have spoken to several experts on US Mexico relations on the podcast over the last several years. But what is your sense of how important immigration will be to the relationship President Sheinbaum will have with her American counterpart, currently Joe Biden, but also the potential next president?
I think from the United States perspective, it is going to be central. And I think Mexico, obviously there's a lot of issues at the United States and Mexico, not just issues, but like a relationship. Since the creation of NAFTA, our economies are much more integrated. We have Mexico as our number one foreign trading partner. The flow of goods and services and people, like legally across the border, is a big issue. There's foreign policy issues that the United States and Mexico are also talking about, particularly Mexico's relationship with China. The United States sees itself increasingly in competition with China and is looking to Mexico to sort of make a choice. Are you with us or are you with China? And Mexico is like, why do we have to choose? We benefit from both of these things. So there are a lot of issues on the bilateral relationship. And yet, I think we are going to see migration and immigration continue to be a very central issue in the relationship. As I mentioned, it's not as politically potent in Mexico, but it's so potent in the United States that the United States will continue to make it a centerpiece of the relationship. And obviously, as we know, the two candidates for president in the United States have somewhat, if not very divergent ideas of what they would do on immigration that would have effects on Mexico. The largest nationality of undocumented people in the United States are from Mexico. So if, for example, former President Trump is elected and decides to mount his major deportation campaign, that would disproportionately affect a lot of Mexicans who would be sent back to Mexico. And that would be an issue for Mexico to receive them back. Vice President Harris has said if she's elected, she would work in Congress to get this bipartisan border legislation passed that would change how we process asylum at the border and again could have effects on how many migrants are coming through or to Mexico. So I think, regardless of who's elected, it's still going to be a centerpiece of the relationship, but exactly what that relationship will look like will very much depend on the outcome of the US election.
So, Teresa, you touched on this. You mentioned that Mexico has been conducting operations to stem the flow of migration to the US Mexico border since December 2023. Yet, their role in decreasing the number of migrants encountered hasn't seemed to break through in the public discourse here. So, why do you think that is?
It's very interesting because obviously we've seen the Biden administration and Vice President Harris claim that their changes to the regulations around asylum, particularly the rules that they put in place in June that restricted asylum between ports of entry, and previous rules about what those standards are and how you claim asylum, have been effective without really mentioning the role of Mexico. So certainly there's a probably domestic political impetus for the administration to claim that what it did was the reason we're seeing fewer migrants at the US Mexico border. But there's also just this tradition in the United States of like, if it happens on the other side of the border, we don't pay attention to it. When former President Trump was in office, he created the Remain in Mexico program, the Migrant Protection Protocols, which saw tens of thousands of migrants waiting in Mexico for cases in the United States. There was widespread reports in Mexico and even in U.S. Papers about the criminality, assaults, kidnappings, threats made against immigrants in Mexico. Sometimes they were living in squalid camps at the border. And that didn't penetrate a lot into the U.S. consciousness. I think for the most part, Americans really don't pay attention that much to what's happening even just across their border in Mexico in their neighbor. So I think there's both political reasons why Mexico's role hasn't been more prominently featured in the U.S. discussion around immigration, but also there's just sort of this tradition of we don't pay that much attention to what's happening on the other side of the line.
So, how much of a focus do you think President Sheinbaum will have on immigration during her 6 year term?
I think there's a couple of things that Mexico is going to have to focus on, whether it's, in the public eye or not. One is, of course, as we talked about, the relationship with the United States and what measures Mexico will take at the behest of the United States to address the number of migrants that arrive at the US-Mexico border, particularly migrants that aren't met from Mexico. How well will Mexico enforce its southern border with Guatemala? I think those will be ongoing conversations and discussions. What's the capacity of Mexico? One of the major entities in Mexico that has been engaged has been the National Guard. And one of the moves that AMLO recently did was to move the National Guard from a civilian law enforcement agency into the military arm in Mexico. So militarizing immigration enforcement here, that's of concern to a lot of immigration advocates in Mexico and in the United States. But it's been seen by the government here as a natural sort of move to help reinforce the work that this agency can do. I think those are the kinds of issues she's going to have to deal with. Another big issue is whether or not to grant many of the immigrants coming into Mexico some sort of work permit while they're here, particularly because of the use of CBP-1 is now expanded to all of Mexico. So no matter where you are in Mexico, you can apply for an appointment, but the appointment may be weeks or months. It may take you weeks or months to get an appointment. So in the meantime, while you're waiting to try to do that, does Mexico provide work authorization? At various times, the government here has or has not done that, depending on whether they feel it's encouraging more people to come. Lastly, it should be noted that Mexico's own asylum system, like the United States, has been overwhelmed by the number of applications it has received. And so that process of deciding who might stay in Mexico, be given protection here, is also one that is growing. So I think that these are all issues, as the number of migrants coming into Mexico increases, if they're not getting to the US border, and they're not being deported back to their own country, that may start creating some pressures on the government here to say, hey, what are we doing with all of these people?
Okay, is there anything else you want to say about this topic, Teresa?
I think I've said it all. I think that there is definitely sort of a anticipation here in Mexico of the outcome of the U.S. elections. They know how important that outcome is to what the relationship between the United States and Mexico is going to look like moving forward, and so on so many issues. So I think that now that they have celebrated their first female president, and they're very proud of that fact, by the way, one of the speakers at the conference I'm at noted that the president of the Congress, who basically inaugurated and swore in Claudia Sheinbaum, was herself a woman, and the head of the Supreme Court in Mexico is also a woman. So they are very proud of the fact that right now their most senior leadership in government are all female, and I think they should celebrate that. I think that's a wonderful thing.
Okay, great. Let's shift gears now to domestic US politics. So, during the vice presidential debate this week, as well as over the last few weeks since the presidential debate, there has been a lot of discussion of the situation of Haitian migrants in the town of Springfield, Ohio, including accusations that have been debunked about the eating habits of these migrants.
Yeah.
But another aspect of the debate surrounds the status of these immigrants. So this week, Dara Lind of the American Immigration Council wrote a blog discussing this very subject. So, Teresa, let's try to unpack this. What is your reading of the situation? Are they here legally or not?
Well, there's been a long-standing kind of discourse around identifying immigrants as being legal or illegal and the terminology around it. But in this particular case, it's kind of one of those things where, certainly former President Trump, the Senator Vance, and many Republicans continue to insist that people who have been granted some form of legal protections by the Biden administration still remain illegally in the United States. And I think that this distinction of legal versus illegal status, that the idea that there's sort of a binary here, is the reality is a lot more complicated than that. So when we talk about many of these Haitians, they may have arrived at the border without a visa, which would render them ineligible to come to the United States, or they may have come between ports of entry, which renders them ineligible to stay in the United States. So that is technically, under immigration law, an illegal act. However, in spite of that, if you ask for asylum, it is legal to do that even if you arrive illegally. And that is clear in immigration law, and courts have reinforced that. So they made a legal claim. And while they are in the United States with that legal claim, and this is true for the Haitians and many others who've arrived at the border in the last many years, they are permitted to remain in the United States, but they don't have a quote unquote visa status. They don't have a permanent resident status. They don't have a temporary visa. They're not a non-immigrant or an immigrant. They're in this kind of limbo, but they're allowed to remain while their case is pending. Added to that, the Biden administration has done some things within its discretionary authority to grant some of these people additional protections from deportation and permissions to remain in the United States. So one of them is this parole program that he created for Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans, that if they have a sponsor in the United States and they meet certain other requirements, they can fly to the United States and be given parole. Now, parole in the immigration context means we are giving you a temporary ability to come into the United States, even though you otherwise wouldn't be eligible, for a limited period of time and the two criteria are for significant public benefit or humanitarian purposes. And the Biden administration has determined that these parole programs, because they are helping to manage the border and because many of these people would be applying for asylum, meet those two criteria. There's ongoing litigation about those programs, but that's their argument. When people arrive on parole, they do have a legal status, but for the grant of parole, their arrival would have been not legal. But because they were granted parole, they are legally in the United States. Then there's another category called temporary protected status, where the government can designate countries that have undergone civil strife, natural disasters, or other domestic circumstances that make it difficult, if not impossible, for them to accept their own nationals back should they be deported. And the Biden administration has made extensive use of this temporary protected status. And so many of the people who arrive, both from Haiti and other countries, either on parole or without parole, but waiting on their asylum case, are now eligible for this TPS. And so, yes, while you have TPS, you are legally in the United States. Both parole and TPS can allow for work authorization. So you're allowed to be in the United States and you're allowed to work while you're in those designated statuses, but neither of them lead to long-term permanent status in the United States. You can't go from TPS or parole into a green card or a non-immigrant visa. So they're kind of, our colleagues at MPI have called them limbo statuses or liminal statuses. It's this in between. And I think that muddies this distinction between, legal immigrants and, illegal immigrants, if you use that term, or undocumented or unauthorized, because they are authorized to be here by the government, but the government has made an exception to allow them. They would not be able to be considered legal under our standard system of temporary visas or green cards, but the government has chosen to give them a different status that allows them to stay. And it's that decision that opponents of those decisions don't like, and one of the reasons why they insist that, no, they're not technically legally here in the United States.
Great. Well, thanks for unpacking that. You mentioned that, there are these two terms, illegal and undocumented. On this podcast, we tend to use the term undocumented immigrants. Um, and there's a lot of discussion about these two terms. So can you explain a little bit about why there is this debate on terminology?
Yeah, I think, in the last, I would say decade and a half, many folks who work with immigrants and who work, in the immigrant advocacy world have made the point that calling someone illegal is at the very least, pejorative. That you see signs that no person is illegal. Whether or not somebody has broken the law by being here or coming here, that doesn't make them illegal, it makes the act. And I think this is a matter of what they feel is really addressing a person rather than the act. And so they find that terminology both pejorative and sometimes, if more than that, offensive, or even, xenophobic, racist. These are all terms that have been used for that term. The alternatives can be undocumented. So you often hear people talk about, do you have your papers? Papers being a shorthand for your immigration visas or your documents. Many people who don't have a legal immigration status in the United States, though, do have documents of some sort, whether they are fraudulent or their own. So, that's one way of turning it. So other groups, including academics, sometimes use the term unauthorized, which means you're here without permission or knowledge of the government. Well, given what I just described about these new statuses that are not traditional visas, but do have documents and are authorized, you can see how this all just gets very, very complicated. And this is all a feature of how complex immigration law is. And this, what has been a part of the immigration political debate for a long time. You often would hear people say, well, I support legal immigration, I just don't support illegal immigration. Well, we've kind of fudged that distinction over time. And part of that is because Congress hasn't really looked at this to update what are the proper legal statuses, what are there additional statuses that might accommodate people. You've had more use of these discretionary statuses, and that's put pressure, I think, on Congress to go back and look at things. So I think, we're hearing it in the presidential election campaigns, certainly. We heard it in the vice presidential debate where the moderators tried to fact check, Senator Vance, and then, he came back and said, no, no, no. And all I wanted to kind of discuss for our audience here is it's a lot more complicated than sort of this, black and white, legal versus illegal. There's a lot of gray when it comes to the immigration law. And that's one of the reasons why people are seeking changes to immigration law. Can we update it so that there is a little more clarity going forward?
So aside from the semantics involved, what difference does it make what the exact status of these immigrants is from a policy perspective?
So just from a pure policy perspective, people who spend a long time in these liminal statuses, first of all, it's discretionary. So a new government can come in and take it away immediately. We saw President Trump try to do that when he was in office with temporary protected status and with DACA, which is another one of these, discretionary statuses. And then President Biden came in and said, no, I'm going to keep them and I'm going to expand it. So that's one of the reasons why there's a policy implication to having so many people, around maybe as many as 1.5 million or 2 million on these different kinds of statuses. The other thing is, as I mentioned, they don't lead to a long-term stability or permanent status in the United States. There's not a way for an individual in one of these statuses really to move from that to, say, getting a green card or even getting a work visa. It's very difficult or impossible for many of them. And so they're constantly in this state of not permanence, but here. And I think that does create issues from a policy perspective. The other thing that makes these situations very tentative is litigation. I mentioned the Cuban, Haitian, Nicaraguan, and Venezuelan parole program is under litigation. Temporary protected status was under litigation when President Trump tried to end it, and the courts made him keep it for a little while. So a court can come in at any time. We're waiting on a decision, for example, in the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals on whether or not DACA will continue to exist. So, because these are discretionary programs by the executive branch, if the court decides that the executive branch exceeded its authority, the programs go away and then people don't have status as well. So I think recognizing that the more people we have in these liminal statuses, these uncertain statuses, their lives are tentative, even though they're allowed to work. Their employers see them as tentative, like, okay, you can work now, but maybe you can't work in the future. There's a lot of reasons they can't buy homes. They can't fully sort of incorporate into the economic life of the country. And yet they're not in immediate place of being deported. They're not going to leave. And so we just keep kind of perpetuating a lot of people being in these uncertain situations in the United States. And I think for immigrants themselves, there's a lot of stress that means for their communities and for the government. The government's going to have to make some decisions about these folks eventually.
Okay, is there anything else you want to add, Theresa?
I think that's enough for today.
Well, great. Yeah, we've covered a lot here. So I think we'll leave it there. And yeah, thanks so much for taking us through that, Theresa.
Thanks a lot, Jack.
And that's a wrap on this episode of This Week in Immigration. One last reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find our podcast episodes on the Bipartisan Policy Center YouTube channel. You can find more information on all the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow the Bipartisan Policy Center on the X platform at BPC_bipartisan. You can follow Theresa Cardinal Brown at BPC_T Brown. And you can follow me at Jack Malde. Send your comments and feedback to us by email to immigration@bipartisanpolicy.org. I'm Jack Malde. This Week in Immigration was created and executive produced by Theresa Cardinal Brown. This episode was written by myself, Rennie Mokri, and Theresa Cardinal Brown. Joshua Joe is our audio editor. The executive producer of BBC Podcasts is Lucy Manning. Talk to you next time on This Week in Immigration.